friends, Jayla here. I'm a bicycle traveler, and when I'm not on the road, I work in a bike shop. And I realized that despite my bikes appearing in nearly every video I make, I've never actually done a video about my bikes. So I thought today I would share a bit about my bikes. These are not all of mine. I share this bike room with my partner, but I do have 3 bikes. So let's get into it. First up, we have my trusty old Rally. I bought this bike for $50 when I decided I wanted to start commuting. Some people I've asked say they think it's from the 60s, some people say the 70s. In any case, it's very old. And that is a great thing for my purposes. Old bikes tend to be made really well. So it's a sturdy steel frame and simple components. I've had it for over 10 years now and I ride it a lot. It's my primary mode of transportation in the city. So I have replaced a lot of the components. The brakes used to be these old school brakes that would kind of pinch down on the cable, and that would mean that eventually the cable would just snap, and that was pretty scary. So I did replace those with more modern brakes. I have Schwalbe Marathon tires on it that are super puncture resistant. It means I barely get any flats, and they have good grip in a wide variety of conditions. I use this bike year round. I don't bike if there is a big snowstorm, or if there's a lot of snow, I just wait until the roads have been plowed and salted. The derailleur it came with broke, and so I did have that replaced with a cheap, simple derailleur. The drivetrain is definitely due for replacement, and I plan to do that this year. It's a 6-speed, which is plenty for the city I live in. The fenders didn't come with the bike, but they are definitely key for city riding because I don't want to get anywhere with a wet bum, so big fan of those. The original saddle it came with eventually rusted completely through, and so I replaced it. That saddle lasted probably decades. This saddle got a tear within the first week, and I was so grumpy about that I just patched it up with duct tape, and I usually put a plastic bag over it. So not the prettiest, but we don't want pretty when we're locking up a bike all over downtown. The city I live in has really high bike theft, and I see that almost every day working in a bike shop. It breaks my heart every time I have to talk to somebody about their bike getting stolen, or their wheels getting stolen, or their saddle, or their grips, or their handlebars. It's wild. Pieces get stolen off bikes all the time here. So having an old bike that's kind of rusty and just doesn't look attractive, paired with a strong kryptonite lock, I feel safe locking this bike up anywhere in the city, and that's what I need it for. So I absolutely love this bike. I haven't toured on it. I kind of want to. I almost did when we did Toronto to Montreal. I would just love that experience. I think it's so cool that people started bike touring on, single speeds and 3 speeds and old steel bikes just like this with, leather saddlebags or backpacks or whatever they had. And I think that's super cool. Technology and advancements have made bike touring and bikepacking so much easier, and I'm super grateful for that. But I think one day I would love to tour on a bike like this and just see what it's like, because I have such respect for all the people that did and pioneered this activity for all of us. This bike was cheap, it requires very little maintenance, and it's not very appealing for a thief, so I am a big fan. It is my favorite bike to commute with in the city. All right, what's next? Next up is my KHS Grit 220. Now, this is the bike I've used as my touring bike for the last 2 years. For my first big solo bike trip in 2019, I wasn't sure if I was going to even like bike touring, and so a family member was kind enough to lend me a bike. And that is what I did my first couple of tours on, and I absolutely fell in love with it. Cut to 2021, it was the middle of the pandemic, and bikes were exceptionally hard to get. I had just started working in a bike shop, and I could see that there was no chance of me getting a bike anytime soon. I was working at the shop when an order for the KHS grits came in, and this one in a size small, perfect for me, had just been canceled by the person who had their name on it, and I scooped it right up. It wasn't my perfect bike touring bike in some ways, but it was available and it has served me so well. But I did make a number of changes to it. First up, it came as a drop bar bike. but I've dealt with wrist pains and eventually had to have wrist surgery, and drop bars just weren't an option for me anymore. So that is why I switched the bike over to butterfly bars. But I held on to all of this because I knew that I was going to have to resell this bike, and it was probably going to make more sense to convert it back to a traditional drop bar bike. I made a whole video about butterfly bars that I will link to below, but suffice it to say that I love them. They have made such a difference for me. The first tour I did on this bike, I used these 700 wheels with their stock tires, but since that first trip, I then had 650 wheels built, and I was riding on those so that I could get wider tires. That was primarily for my trip to Turkey, but I found that I really loved 650s and I loved wider tires, and so I've been using the bike with those tires ever since. The drivetrain is 2x9, which I find pretty good gearing. If you're familiar with gear inches, on the upper end, I'll have to look it up. I think it's around like 110. It's at a point that I basically never spin out. And on the lower end, it goes down to 24 gear inches. That was a big improvement on my original bike. It only went down to 36 gear inches. That just sounds like a bunch of gibberish if you're not familiar with gear inches. But basically, the lower your gear inches, the easier it is to pedal upwards. So the bike that I'll show you just after this, my new bike, goes down to 17 gear inches. So it makes it a lot easier to keep pedaling, especially with weight on the bike when you're going uphill. On this bike, I'm able to keep pedaling on a lot of hills, but I do sometimes need to push. So it was a big improvement, but I knew from this bike that I was going to want to adjust the gearing to make it even easier to pedal up hills with a loaded bike. It's an aluminum frame and carbon fork, which I knew wasn't going to be ideal for me long term because I want to be able to tour all over the world, and generally speaking, steel is better for that. But again, emergency bike, and the aluminum carbon has done just fine for me so far. And it does make for a very light bike, which is nice. This is not the actual saddle I use on this bike. I typically use the seat post and saddle that's currently on my next bike, which I will show you. This is just the stock seat post and saddle for now, but this saddle is definitely too narrow for these handlebars, which is why I have the Brooks saddle. It's mechanical disc brakes, which was a nice change from my original rim brake bike. I find I get really good braking power, especially now that it's more of a flat bar position. I find it really easy to brake in any situation, no matter how much weight is on my bike. The only issue I've had with this bike is that one of the rack bolts stripped really easily. I installed a rack on it once and uninstalled it, and when I went to reinstall it again, the threads were stripped, and that was when we had gotten to Turkey, so that was really stressful. But the bike does come with a central mounting point, so when I got back from that trip, I got a rack that has a central mounting point, and it hasn't been an issue since. This baby has served me so well, and I have grown slightly attached to it just because of the adventures it has taken me on. But ultimately, it's not really a long-term solution for me, which I will explain when I bring out my long-term solution. So unfortunately, in order to finance that bike, I will have to sell this beauty, but somebody else will get to enjoy it, so it's okay. Now, last up is my Surly Bridge Club custom build. Now, unlike my Rally, where I knew absolutely nothing about bikes when I bought it, or my Grit, where I knew a little bit about bikes when I bought it, my Surly, I spent probably a year conceptualizing and ordering the parts and building myself. It was a big process, and I actually made a whole video about it, which I will link below. But my goal was basically to build up a bike that I could take anywhere in the world. And though I haven't taken on any tours yet, I have test ridden it a lot, and I am really in love with it so far. Basically, over the last few years of bike touring and bike packing, I've found that I really like to be away from the main roads, on quieter roads, and in more remote locations. So I knew I wanted a steel frame that, if it had issues, could potentially be welded. I knew I wanted clearance for thick tires so that I could go off-road. So my mechanic friend helped me build up these 27.5 wheels. I went with a Shimano Dior 2x10 drivetrain. This gives me a really wide range of gears. My lowest gear inches with my current setup is 17 inches. So this will hopefully keep me able to continue pedaling up climbs with a heavy load on my bike. And I went with a Velo Orange Crazy Bar handlebars. I loved my butterfly bars, but I just kind of felt like something different, and I wanted to experience what it's like to have that kind of wider position and the kind of control that gives you. And I like that this handlebar setup still has a number of different hand positions to prevent fatigue. Because it's a steel frame and wide handlebars, it kind of looks like a tank, and I expected it to maybe feel like a tank. I wasn't expecting it to feel as light as it does. The drivetrain and the wheels really give it this incredibly smooth ride feel, and I just feel like I can ride so easily on it. So I'll keep you posted when I take it on an actual full tour, but so far I am just really loving it, and I can't wait to get it out on the road for an adventure. If you want more of the specs on this bike and why I picked all the different components I did do a Q&A series as well, which I will link those videos below as well. Those are my 3 bikes. I love each of them for different reasons, and I would love to hear from you. What bikes do you use and love, or do you have a dream bike that you have your eye on? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to support my channel, consider joining me over on Patreon. Not only do you help make videos like this one possible, but you also get the behind the scenes scoop and some extra bikepacking tips and tricks. Thanks for being here. See you in the next one. Bye.